Welcome to the great conversation where ideas matter. Ideas shape markets. Ideas can change the world. And the author I have on the great conversation today changed my world. Let me tell you why. I have been the family historian. I was the kid asking Grandpa what he did and all his adventures around Cuba. He told me about going across the United States and his Model T. He talked about his adventures with the senoritas in Cuba when he was a teenager. He would leave his home in Athens, Georgia, and get on the boat and go to Cuba. Yeah, that was my grandfather. He also was invisible, because those of you who don't know it, there were people who put the grid up years ago. Yeah, they put the grid up. The electricity you have today, that heat your homes, he was the guy. He put that entire grid up, but he's invisible to most of you. And I was thinking about invisible, the word invisible. How many of your employees are invisible? They're the quiet ones. They're the ones doing their duty. They're the ones who aren't disengaged like 80% of us, according to Gallup. They're the ones who put in a good workday because it's the right thing to do, and they have faith it'll pay off in the end. If not for them, multi-generationally with their kids and their grandchildren. Today, I'm with a guy who's going to help us discover the invisible about us through his story of his family. Doug Melville, welcome to the great conversation.
Thank you so much for having me here today.
Absolutely. First, let's just get it right out the door here. You're about to hit the bestseller list. Let's hope, let's cross our fingers, but there's a reason it's resonating with people. Tell me about your journey in writing this book and why you think it's resonating.
Yeah, so this book is really a culmination of 10 years of research and 2 years of writing, but it was put together to cover my family story from Ulysses S. Grant all the way until today, and cover the 8 presidents they worked for, the 2 men in my family that became America's first 2 Black generals, and also how we've honored them at West Point and the Air Force Academy since uncovering the story. So it's really a living, fluid story that really shares the fact that history was, quote unquote, long time ago, but it's really here today. And we really can still find so much purpose in ourselves. So 2 weeks ago, when we started talking to different media outlets about coming on and so forth, it was picking up okay. But then we got the opportunity when I got invited to come on The Daily Show. So when Comedy Central reached out and said, listen, The Daily Show is considering booking you, and they put me on at the desk for a 9-minute segment, that was when something changed my life. When people sometimes talk about there's one moment, but I think when you're an author, you don't really know if the world is going to love your piece of art, if it's going to be rejected, if it's going to be criticized. And I think as a first-time author, you don't even know if you're a good writer. You have Kirkus and other reviews, Publishers Weekly, other places reviewing the work, and you just get scared, even though they say don't look at reviews, the book's already done. But first time anything, so that was a big deal. And once the Daily Show hit and the reviews started coming out, the momentum just picked up more and more and more. PBS, The Breakfast Club, CBS News, Time Magazine, people started reaching out. And that led me really here to the great conversation, but also led me to get a note that said we are in the running for the New York Times bestseller list. So we'll hope that today in 5 and 17 minutes, they're supposed to send out the email. So, we'll let you know. But thanks for asking about it, because I think
that will definitely go into my write-up here. We're poised. We're 17 minutes away, literally about the time we'll be ending this podcast. We'll know if Doug Melville is on the bestseller list with his book, Invisible Generals. Doug, again, why is it resonating? Here's what I do know after reading your book. You're articulate. You yourself said, I didn't realize I had this in me, but you could bring up that story at the drop of a dime. And you brought it up many times spontaneously. That's how you best work in your speaking engagements, spontaneously. You have the gift of story, obviously, or people wouldn't be asking you to speak. So tell me why this story is so meaningful to you.
Yeah, I think number one is, like you said, I know the story so well at this point. It's like no one can story me, if they needed to. But history is complicated and people come from different angles. But this is a story of America's first two black generals, a father and a son with the same name. And at the start of World War II, before they were generals, they were the only two black officers in the entire United States military out of 335,000 people.
That's incredible. But wait, go back a step though, because we're talking 300 years of history here. Go back a step. Ben Sr., who you call Ollie in the book, Ben Sr. rode horses.
Yeah, Ben Sr. rode horses. And actually, if we go back one more generation, four generations back past me,
yeah,
you have a gentleman in our family named Lewis Davis, and Lewis Davis was born as a servant, grew up in the house of a gentleman by the name of General Logan, who people know in America, Logan Airport in Boston, most notably Logan Circle and Square in Chicago and DC. And General Logan brought this young boy into his home, raised him as a servant, but almost as a son or a mentor in a very, personal way, because at that time, these young children were at the disposal of whoever they work for. So they could have treated them bad or good or helped them or hurt them, whatever. And this General Logan really raised Lewis as, a young man and got him a job babysitting Ulysses S. Grant's oldest son. And when Grant was going for his second presidential inauguration, there's a story about in the buggy was Grant, Lewis Davis, and Grant's son on his knee as they rode into the White House that day. And I just say to myself, it's unbelievable to think about this is the relationship that actually started it all, because when General Logan helped Lewis Davis secure a career by getting a job at the Department of the Interior, expanding the post office westward, he said, "How can I help your son?" And he said, "My son doesn't want to work in the government, although that's what they had wanted him to do. He wants to battle and go to West Point," and gives him the signature of the congressman in the district needed to get in. And it goes all the way to the desk of President McKinley. And President McKinley rejects it and says, "We don't want to get in the habit of allowing blacks into West Point." So Ben Sr., knowing that he can't get the family hookup, runs away in a one-way train ticket to Wyoming and joins, at the time, the Buffalo Soldiers, which were pushing the Native Americans west. When he's in the Buffalo Soldiers, he meets Charles Young, the only other black graduate of West Point, and Charles Young becomes his mentor and says, "You need to have a specialty," and this is where Ben Sr. went into equestrian and horse riding, "and you need to realize you can graduate and get through West Point, but you'd have to have a son and raise him from the time he was born and train him almost like a LeBron does with Bronny or Shador and Deion Sanders from the time they're born to be a military general, and then you could get them into West Point." And the craziest part about this, to me, Ron, is that Ben Davis Sr. does it. He doesn't just say, okay. He becomes a great equestrian, so much so that President McKinley hears about it, and in 1901 elevates him to officer status and writes a note that he saved him 2 years of his life by not having him go to West Point. And then Ben Sr. gets a wife, has 3 kids, and his wife dies in childbirth. And then he becomes a single dad, trying to make his son feel good, brings him flying one day in a barnstorming for $5, which was 1 week's pay, And his son, Ben Jr., comes down and goes, "Daddy, I want to be a pilot." And instead of him saying, "I'm a single dad, you know the struggle we're going through," he said, "I can help you get that dream a reality, but you have to listen to me. Even the United States of America cannot turn down a West Point grad that graduated in the top third of their class. So if you want to be a pilot, the private sector segregated. This is the only way." And he then commits his life to ensuring his son's dream, and they become the first two Black generals in American history.
I love that one story too, when Ben Jr. Has to pass the entry exam and he fails the first time. Mm-hmm. It's like all this preparation, and he fails because he hadn't gone through two segments, or he would have, of course, because he could digest information. He could take a test on it. But that wasn't a subject area he had done. Was it history? What was it? I forget what it was that he missed. But he ended up failing those two things. But the grit and the persistence of the guy, he goes back and he just doubles down. And he comes back a year later, passes, and gets in.
That's exactly right. He was not great at mathematics.
It was mathematics.
And he went for 1 year after failing the entry test. Yeah. And his dad drops him off at the train. And this is where the story became so personal to me. It was a dad in Chicago dropping his son on the train, love you, go to school. You know, it happens all over America millions of times. And his son gets to school, pulled in the commandant's office. Under the sign it says duty, honor, and country, told that he needs to wait for his room assignment. And then when he gets it, it's a single room at the end of the hallway that was a converted closet. Goes to bed that night scared, thinking about like first night of college. Wakes up the next day, hears the pitter patter of feet, runs down to a meeting in the sinks because he's late. Goes to open the door's locked. He wasn't invited at all. He thought he was missing it. And they go, "We accidentally let a Black cadet in. We are to silence him and treat him as if he's invisible until he drops out." And the man goes back to his room, calls his dad, and his dad goes, "I trained you for this moment. There are 13 million Blacks on the other side. I need you to do two things. Write the date on the wall and that you're going to graduate. And number two, no matter what anybody does, you have to ignore it and get through this."
Yeah. Very Jackie Robinson kind of moment. Tricky. Yeah.
Yeah. That's right.
That's right. No, it was the only way to survive. And it's so funny. There's all sorts of examples of people in history who have taken that approach. And I got to tell you, here's what I walked away with. That approach still holds true, especially with people of color, but it still holds true for all of us, doesn't it? Putting that date on the wall and keeping the eye on the prize, even if everything around you is conspiring against you, and do it with a degree of decorum and integrity and respect for the process. And you said something in the book that was incredible. I forget if it was a quote from your grandfather or your great-grandfather. Use the system to diffuse the system. That is, if you're working within a company today, and it's a screwed up company, just like people are screwed up, use the system to diffuse the system. Tell me about that. Tell me about that DNA that's in your tribe there, Doug.
Yeah. And you know, that saying was something that was passed down in our family. And that was kind of the mantra or motto. We don't really have a shield, you know, or a crest, but if we did in our imagination, it would say you have to use the system to diffuse the system. And basically this was just the thinking that there are many ways to make change, disrupt, educate, inform, inspire. Some do it through protesting, some do it through art. Our family's motto was do it through the system, through performance. And by using the system, first you start by getting in it. You can't change anything from outside. The second thing is you have to get a voice. Once you get a voice, that turns into a vote. Once you get a vote, that can turn into consensus, and that can turn into policy.
There you go.
So this was a long way, because the second part of the saying that they would always say was, the impossible takes time, but in time you can accomplish the impossible, which was the second half of it. Because when you use the system to diffuse it, this may take a while. And that was the thing, Ron. It was, you could do it, but it's going to take some time. So you also have to know that the mission continues even past your time. And that's why I felt so committed to bring this to life, because I feel like I'm still executing their idea of what needed to be done.
So how do you teach kids? How do you teach young adults? How do you teach adults that the long game is a great game? It's a pure game. You may not see it in this lifetime, Martin Luther King. You may not see it in your lifetime, but you will see it. How do you think people create the long game? How do you think that is infused in multi-generational family like yourself?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's very personal, because I don't think my brother and sister, I have cousins. I mean, just because you're in the same family doesn't mean everybody is, monolithic in thinking. I'm sure you have a few rogue family members. I'll just throw that out there. I don't know. But I think the way they looked at negativity and people that were misguided, or people that may have tried to oppress or put them down, was simply the fact that some people standing next to you have different opportunities than you have. And those opportunities were earned by people that came before them. And if we don't have opportunities because of our skin color, or because of whatever the case may be, women for their gender, what have you, then we have a heavier burden to carry that we are responsible for. So our next generation can live in the best light, like the kids from today's generation. So they actually never trained me or talked to me about the excuse. They just said, you have to look at this in a different way. That way is going to take time, and go through it. And if it doesn't finish, pass it to the next one. Now, I don't have any kids. So, Ron, I got to find nephews and cousins. I'm looking around in case I don't have a baby, and say, who's picking this up?
Well, it's so funny. I love that story too of Ben has died, Ben Jr. And it's years later, and Mom is going to hand off everything, all the memories,
Yes,
all
this
the
is
stuff he
big.
collected, to the museum. And you're, of course, trying to construct a legacy yourself, and you're trying to figure out what that exchange of value looks like. But then West Point decides to build a new building. They don't build very many new buildings at West Point.
No, very
And
rare.
they're going to honor that with the name of somebody who's graduated from West Point. And of course, your grandfather is under consideration.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll just cut this story short, but he ends up getting the name. But I love that one story in the book where I think one of the laborers or the architects walks over and shows you something he's carved on the stone.
Yeah,
Tell us about that.
So what was so interesting about this was there was 3 names up for consideration, and this is how this is where the research turned on. This is where there was a revolution that led to an evolution. But starting back to where we began, I set a Google alert after leaving the Red Tails movie. I did 3 years of research. I made a commitment that the next time the Google alert went off, I was going to share the story of whomever it went off for. And it just so happened it was West Point, considering this barracks. And like you said, there hasn't been a new barracks there in, 30, 40 years. And the way they do the naming at West Point, it's the height and the location within campus and the type of building are dictated by the gravitas of the honor. So the highest building in the campus, in the dead middle of the campus, because they moved a big mountain that was in the middle, a rock, and the barracks are the highest. So this was the triple highest honor in the campus. So there's 3 names to be selected. And I share with the men and the women at the table that day, the story that I shared about these 2 men and the family. I shared with them that that his name was not in the graduation directory online when I went up there. I shared that his last meeting here in 1986 was to offer him a photo in the campus that he didn't want because it said first African American general in the Air Force, and he just wanted it to say general. And they didn't want to do that. So they separated and just de facto both just went their own way. And there was no conversation with West Point. So when I heard that his name was up for one of these barracks, I just couldn't lose this opportunity. And it was one of the workers who brought us down to see. There was a few of us Army Corps of Engineers when they were showing the building. And he walked me over and goes, I read the story of this man and put a cornerstone over here that said something to the effect is one day the cornerstone will be the foundation of what we build in the future. And the guy starts crying, and I invite him and all the workers back to the ribbon cutting ceremony. And West Point goes, Doug, you can't invite everybody who laid granite in this building for 5 years. And they all showed up.
Oh, wow.
And I said, but they're the ones that were invisible.
Absolutely.
Built this building and brought it to life. And they were the Bens. And I wanted them to be there with me. And that was something that was really important and special when we cut that ribbon in 2017.
Yeah, he told you it came from the Bible, Psalm 118:22. The stone which the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. So the whole story of racism in our country, what he had to endure going through years of silent treatment throughout his term, can't even imagine, not even being in the directory, and now he's the cornerstone.
It's unbelievable. And I remember my dad crying and crying, going, Doug, he goes, Doug, Ben would never, I get chills. He goes, he would never believe this.
No.
He would have never been able to, he would have never believed it.
No.
He would have never believed it.
So this story, like I opened up with, this may be on its surface a story, a wonderful family story, rediscovering the family legacy, a quest to make your family visible because they were in some significant moments in the history of our country and had an impact and influence on the outcomes that have made us a country today. A wonderful story. But behind that story, tucked in the back, surprisingly becomes a story for all of us to rediscover what is invisible. Tell us about why you decided to include that segment in the book and maybe some of the key things you want us all to remember.
Yeah, I think for me, it was very important at the end to realize that I was just a regular guy with a very irregular story at my fingertips, and what were the things that I did to start, because sometimes this looks daunting when I say 10 years. When someone first asked me how long did I work at, 10 years, I'm sitting there going, 10 years, who would do that? But the thing is, it started slow, one foot in front of the other. And it, and in the back of the book, it's how to be a visible general, where I walk through the steps people can take. The first step is set a Google alert for any prominent family members of note. Know your family. You don't have to make a tree, but if there's a few names or a few details from someone that you think would help, I think that's super important.
Well,
Next,
real quick on that, just to pause for a second, apologize, but that's a big one because someone mentored you on something called a monument tree. Is that correct?
Yeah. So someone mentored me to really help understand, just what all about the family. I mean, we didn't know who was the brothers, who are the sisters, who are the cousins,
Yeah.
and when you start writing family stories, there's all kinds of different people. You can't include everyone, because it's hard, and the hard thing about this book was 150-year time period. So that was another challenge that, how do you write a 150-year story and make it sound interesting and like, just a small book. But once I learned who the family was, I had a lot of conversations with my dad. And I think these are the living testaments and storytellers. Like you said, you're the family historian, but getting people to talk that are from the silent generation that may be covering up trauma or just want to protect you, it's not easy. I mean, people just don't want to talk about it. So, my mother didn't know the story. They've been married over 50 years. And then when he tells me the story, I get so infatuated with it that I just kind of make a de facto way on how to research. And when West Point contacted us and named the barracks, then they opened up their archives to us. Every test, every paper that he did, his application, all in pencil, still perfect. Like, just like it's done. I'm looking at this going, this is 90 years old.
Amazing.
And then they called the Air Force Academy and they said, well, the Air Force Academy was really, founded by a group of men, and the person responsible for allowing women into the Air Force Academy was Ben Davis Jr. when he proposed women should have equal opportunities. So there needs to be something for him there. And then they named the airfield after him, which is the airport in the center of campus. Mm-hmm. And then after that, then we get the Air Force's historian to give us all the information about what planes, what sorties, when it happened, where it happened. So you got to get it going. But in this case, it was almost like the gerrymandering of history, where all the information was there. It's just one dot here, one piece here, one move here.
I want to end with something. So Doug, you've been an entrepreneur. You've started several companies, and then you went into corporate America to do something that you had to learn what it was at first, called DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion.
I didn't know it was a real job. I didn't. I mean, some would argue today, don't get me started. Some would argue today, they don't know if it's a real job now, but I believe it's a real job. I believe in it more than ever, but at the time I was not familiar.
Well, forget about programmatically DEI, but those three words are very powerful words, right? And words are real things. But it's interesting because it'd be fun to think about how you approach DEI programmatically when your family, I love this quote in the book, Doug, we're not Black, we're not African American, Doug, we're Americans. Tell me about that. That in itself is a family legacy.
Yeah, and this is something that when Ben Jr. wrote his book, he wouldn't publish it if it wasn't titled American. So he was very adamant, to me particularly, my dad a little bit, but me really, that I should go through life only as American and I should never label myself, because he fought for integration and for us to be all called Americans.
Yeah, we weren't made equal, we were born equal.
That's right. That's right. I like this energy. And this is actually how he would speak about it. He was very passionate about it.
Right.
And he would tell me that later in life, people would argue with him. And he actually shared the story about Jesse Jackson coming up with the term African American and how he called different Black leaders to buy in and how he didn't really want to buy in because he just thought we should all be Americans. But I bring this up because I end the book talking about at the end of their life when the Smithsonian wanted to collect the items to live forever in the confines and rooftops underneath the Air and Space Museum. So this was a huge get for the museum and huge for Ben and his wife. And as they come to collect the items, Benjamin Davis Jr.'s wife for over 60 years is crossing out the word African in front of American as items are taken out of the home.
Yeah.
And she ended up writing a note, which I briefly bring up, that said, in the eyes of history, they feel they've earned the right to be known as Americans. And when you put it this way, that fought all the way since Ulysses S. Grant for equality and earned it, that the least the country could do is identify them only as Americans. And I always wonder what they would think about now, when we've really put people in different boxes. You can always argue, is it better or worse? If there was no boxes, would it be more beneficial, less beneficial? You can go down the sociological timeline. But the importance to me here is the strength of going through all those things where your country is against you, and you still want to go above and beyond to ensure that you are looked at as American. And for him to die on the 4th of July,
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, Doug, I'd say to my community, you are history in the making. And what you leave behind will be based on the performance of your actions tied to your integrity and character. This book is not only a story of that narrative and how it works, but also gives lessons on how it can work for you. Doug, this has been a great conversation, and I can't wait to hear from you when you get on that New York Times bestseller list.
You will be the first call. How about we make a deal? I make the list. You're the last interview before it and the first one after it.